Okay, let's dive in. We're heading back, way back, to ancient Athens. We all know it as the birthplace of democracy, right?
Right, the classic image.
But Athens also had this, well, this really quite terrifying political tool, almost like a safety feature, but a scary one.
You mean the power of the citizens themselves to just, well, remove someone?
Exactly. The power of the ordinary people, the citizen body, to essentially kick out any individual who got too big for their boots, too successful, maybe too fast, or, just too powerful for comfort.
It really was an environment defined by what you might call high-stakes accountability. I mean, think about it. You have these military heroes, figures who reach the absolute pinnacle of fame, maybe even saved the city.
Indispensable, you might think.
You'd think so,
Yeah.
but they were always perpetually vulnerable to the collective will. And that will could be, let's face it, pretty volatile sometimes.
So this deep dive today, we're going on a journey through the sources, aren't we? Trying to get a handle on this tension.
That's the plan. We want to look at the intersection of military glory, all that political maneuvering that went with it, and then this ultimate threat hanging over them, banishment, condemnation. What did it really mean to lead in such a powerful and potentially dangerous democracy?
Our mission, then, isn't just to say people got banished, it's to sort of map out the mechanics of how fragile political life could be.
Exactly. We want to understand the system of accountability, maybe even condemnation. What did it actually look like day to day in Athens?
And maybe compare it a bit. See how that Athenian approach, that democratic censure, stacks up against, well, the much darker stuff we see later in Rome, like those really violent political removals.
Yeah, the contrast is pretty stark sometimes. And hopefully exploring this will give you, the listener, some real aha moments.
How so?
Well, specifically by showing how basically any powerful state, ancient or modern, really struggles with this balancing act.
Yeah.
How do you handle the massive, often necessary power of a truly gifted individual, a hero, even without compromising state security or, popular control?
It's about the scrutiny, isn't it? The constant pressure these famous figures were under.
Absolutely. Knowing that the very same people cheering your victories today could, maybe tomorrow, decide you're just too dangerous to have around anymore. That's intense pressure.
Okay, so let's start where things really heated up, at the peak of Athenian power and prestige. When we talk about this kind of dangerous fame in Athens, especially during that heroic period of the Persian Wars, two names just jump out: Themistocles and Aristides.
They're the giants of the era, no question.
I mean, these guys literally helped save Greece. They won unbelievable glory. You'd imagine that would set them up for life, politically speaking.
You would think. But instead, that very achievement, that immense success, almost immediately put them in political danger. It's paradoxical.
So the context is absolutely key here, isn't it? How they gained power and how that power was instantly kind of questioned.
It really is everything. Let's start with Marathon, the Battle of Marathon. Huge victory. We know Themistocles, son of Neocles, was right there fighting in the ranks of his tribe, the Leontid tribe.
And the victory itself was just staggering, wasn't it? The numbers.
Oh, the numbers tell a story. The Athenian losses were tiny, relatively speaking, something like 192 killed. But the Persian losses, the sources reckon around 6,400. It was a massive, almost unbelievable success.
And that moment, Marathon, it set the stage. It secured Greece's immediate freedom, right? Before the later battles like Plataea and Mycale finished the job.
It was foundational.
Yeah.
But here's where Themistocles starts to stand out politically. He saw something that maybe others, even Aristides, didn't grasp quite as early or as clearly.
Which was?
That Athens' future wasn't just going to be secured by those heavy infantry, the hoplites fighting on land. He saw the sea. He understood that the sea was the real key to Athenian power.
The Navy. That becomes his big thing.
It becomes the big thing for Athens. His insight was absolutely crucial for the whole direction of the Athenian Empire and for its democracy, too, its radical democracy.
How so? How does the Navy connect to democracy?
Well, the victory that really cemented Athens' dominance, the one that essentially guaranteed Greece's freedom in the long run, was Salamis, the naval battle. And Themistocles masterminded that strategy.
Right.
And he understood that this naval power, this fleet, was what underpinned the growing radical democracy. Because who rode the ships?
Not the wealthy landowners.
Exactly. It was the common folk, the poorer citizens.
Yeah.
His vision connected advanced democracy directly to sea power. It was this deep truth. The city's power rested more and more on the ordinary guys pulling the oars, not just the traditional landowners, the hoplites and the well-born.
Okay, so that insight alone, pushing for naval power, must have made him controversial. It shifted the power balance.
Immediately, it politicized his success. To achieve what he did, you needed not just military genius, but also, frankly, a lot of political guts. Audacity, even.
And the sources give us this incredible story about his cunning after the wars when Athens needed to rebuild. The wall story.
Yes. The deception around rebuilding Athens' walls against Spartan witches. It's a classic Themistocles move, and it shows the kind of, well, subterfuge that was sometimes necessary.
So Sparta didn't want Athens to have walls. They were worried.
Deeply worried. They feared a rival power center emerging, so they basically demanded Athens stop rebuilding its fortifications. Athens sends Themistocles as the lead envoy to Sparta to discuss this.
Okay.
But what does he do? He gets there and just stalls.
Yeah.
Deliberately does nothing. He makes excuses. Oh, my fellow envoys, Aristides and Abronichus, they haven't arrived yet. I can't possibly proceed without them. All very proper.
He's playing for time. But what was going on back in Athens while he was dragging his feet in Sparta?
Oh, that's the genius of it. While he's running this masterful delay tactic, and the personal risk if the Spartans caught on was immense, war, imprisonment, maybe worse.
Right, huge gamble.
Back in Athens, the entire city was mobilized. The sources make a point of this. Everyone, men, women, children, working flat out day and night to get that wall built. And critically, they didn't hold back on materials. They spared nothing. They apparently tore down parts of private houses, even sacred buildings, anything to get stone and materials quickly. Total collective effort, total emergency footing.
Sacrificing temples for walls, that shows desperation or maybe incredible determination.
It tells you everything about the perceived threat, and maybe about Themistocles' influence and his willingness to push boundaries. So by the time Aristides and Abronichus finally do arrive in Sparta and the full delegation is assembled.
The wall's already built, or high enough anyway.
Exactly. High enough to be defensible, Themistocles can drop the act. The Spartans are presented with a done deal, a fait accompli. They basically had to lump it.
Incredible. It shows that top-level success back then wasn't just about battles. It needed serious political maneuvering, maybe even bending the rules.
High-stakes politics, absolutely.
Right.
Audacity and, yeah, institutional subterfuge were part of the toolkit for someone like Themistocles.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the actual job these guys often held. The general, the strategos.
Right, the 10 annually elected generals.
They were the military experts, commanding armies, fleets. But as we're seeing, they weren't operating in a vacuum. They had this constant shadow hanging over them, the politics back home.
A massive shadow. The strategos was, for a time, an incredibly powerful position. Think of Pericles holding it year after year. But our sources, especially later ones, do suggest a kind of perceived decline, a feeling that things weren't what they used to be.
How do we know that?
Well, there's this fascinating fragment from a comedy by Eupolis called The Demes. It's written later, obviously, but he has this scene where the ghosts of the great old leaders, Miltiades, Themistocles, Aristides, Pericles, are summoned back.
And what do they do?
They basically look around and deplore what they see as degenerate Athens. It's satire, of course, but it clearly taps into a feeling that the city had somehow fallen from the standard set during that heroic Persian war generation.
And was this decline, if it was real, linked to how the government was structured, something changing in how decisions were made?
Yes, absolutely. There was a fundamental shift happening, what some scholars call the divorce of military command from political leadership in the assembly.
Meaning the generals weren't necessarily the ones swaying the crowds anymore.
Exactly. This is where the strategoi got into a really tricky position. They were the experts, often wealthy, educated, trained in warfare. But increasingly in the assembly, they found themselves up against different kinds of leaders. Demagogues, essentially.
Leaders of the people.
Right. And these guys were often, tradesmen, people from ordinary backgrounds. They might have had zero military experience or training, but they were brilliant speakers. They knew how to work the assembly, how to persuade the crowds with rhetoric.
So you could have a situation where a highly experienced general is trying to explain a complex military strategy.
And he gets shouted down or outmaneuvered politically by someone whose main skill is just captivating the audience.
Absolutely.
That was the inherent political disadvantage.
The military experts were sort of structurally set up to fail in that political arena sometimes.
You could definitely argue that. When it came to debating policy, especially complex stuff, they were often at a disadvantage against masters of popular persuasion. And the risk, the personal risk, was enormous. Commanders knew failure in the field could easily mean condemnation, exile, even death back in Athens.
And we have that just heartbreaking, catastrophic example of what this political pressure could do, Nucius in Sicily.
Ah, Nucius, yes. The expedition to Syracuse. The situation was already a disaster, militarily speaking. They were in deep trouble.
And he gets sound military advice, right? To cut their losses and get out.
He does. His co-commander, Demosthenes, a capable general, basically tells him, look, we need to retreat now, while we still can. It was strategically the right call.
But Nicias refuses. Why? Why ignore good advice in such a desperate situation?
Because, according to our main source, Thucydides, the defining feature of Nicias' political character was fear. Specifically fear of responsibility, and even more specifically, his overwhelming fear of the censure, perhaps the condemnation of the Athenian assembly.
He was more afraid of the politicians back home than the enemy army in front of him.
That's precisely the analysis.
Yeah.
He was terrified of what would happen if he ordered a retreat and had to face the music in Athens.
And Thucydides uses this really interesting, almost literary comparison to explain this fear, doesn't he? Something about Polydamas and the Trojan women.
He does. It's a fantastic detail, and it really gets to the heart of Nicias' flaw. The reference is to Homer's Iliad.
Okay.
In the Iliad, there's a Trojan advisor named Polydamas who gives Hector sound, cautious, strategic advice before a battle Hector knows he'll likely lose. But Hector rejects it.
Yeah.
Why? Because he says he fears the gossip and reproach of the Trojan women, the ordinary folk watching from the city walls, more than he fears battlefield death.
So Nicias is being compared to Hector in that moment.
Exactly. Thucydides is saying Nicias, like Hector, feared the popular outcry, the emotional, maybe irrational judgment of the crowd, the assembly, the Trojan women of Athens, far more than he feared military defeat or the actual enemy. He was paralyzed by the thought of being ridiculed, blamed, and politically destroyed back home if he ordered what looked like a cowardly retreat.
And that fear, that political anxiety, which was arguably a character flaw, directly led to
Utter disaster. The complete destruction of the Athenian expeditionary force, thousands killed or captured. It was a catastrophic blow to Athens, a major turning point in the Peloponnesian War. And according to Thucydides, it stemmed directly from the commander's crippling fear of political consequences back home. The fear of removal was more potent than the fear of the enemy.
Wow. Okay, so that fear Nicias felt, that constant threat of democratic censure, really gets us to the core of Athenian political life, doesn't it? That volatility.
It does. And it connects to how some critics, especially those with oligarchical sympathies, viewed Athenian democracy itself. They didn't necessarily see conflict or disagreement as a breakdown of the system.
More like normal.
Almost, yeah. Some sources suggest they saw conflict as a sort of normalized part of society, which kind of challenges our modern idea that law exists purely to stop private disputes.
And this political reality was tied up with the economy, right? Especially with that sea power we talked about.
Absolutely inseparable. We have this very clear viewpoint, again from an oligarchical critic, that really nails the connection between advanced democracy and sea power. The argument went something like this. In Athens, it's actually right and proper that the poor and the common folk should have more power than the nobles and the rich.
That sounds counterintuitive for an oligarch to say. Why would they argue that?
Well, the reasoning was purely pragmatic and maybe a bit cynical. Why should the poor have more power? Because they're the ones who row the ships. They're the ones who provide the manpower that makes the city powerful and wealthy through its naval empire. Not the hoplites and the well-born, the traditional land-based aristocracy.
So power should follow function, essentially. Whoever powers the fleet gets the political clout.
That's the argument presented. It's a recognition, maybe a grudging one, of where Athens' real strength lay. And it meant a fundamental shift away from traditional aristocratic power structures.
And that power held by the common people, it showed up directly in places like the law courts, because the juries were mostly made up of ordinary citizens.
Exactly. The jury pool, the diasteria, tended to be dominated by poorer, older citizens who had the time to serve. So if you were a wealthy Athenian involved in a lawsuit, you weren't just arguing your case based on the law. You had to navigate this underlying class dynamic.
You had to worry about resentment.
Definitely. The sources show that wealthy litigants often had to make specific appeals in their speeches. They'd plead with the jury not to treat them differently, not to hold their wealth against them.
Really, they'd explicitly address that.
Yes. There was a palpable fear, reflected in courtroom speeches, that the jurors' envy, that's the word sometimes used, might actually motivate them to punish the wealthy defendant, maybe ruin them financially, simply because they were rich.
So the legal system itself was kind of a battleground for class tension. Makes being elite sound pretty risky.
It could be intensely risky. Your wealth and status could make you a target, not just politically, but judicially, too.
Okay, let's move from that general atmosphere of censure and risk to the actual formal ways people could be removed. Forced exile. You mentioned the famous ostracism earlier, the potsherds.
Right, the ostrakon, that's the one everyone knows, the annual vote where citizens could scratch a name on a pottery shard, and if one person got, 6,000 votes?
They were banished for 10 years. No trial, no defense, just gone.
Exactly, a purely political removal designed to preempt a perceived threat. But the fascinating thing is, while ostracism is famous, the detailed mechanics of how that specific vote worked aren't perfectly preserved in our sources.
Really? So we don't know the exact procedure.
We have the general idea, but not all the nitty-gritty. But what the sources do show very clearly is that Athens had other incredibly detailed and sometimes permanent legal structures for banishment and for enforcing that banishment. It wasn't just the ostracism vote.
Ah, okay. So other ways to end up exiled.
Yes, often through the regular judicial process.
Yeah.
And the law was incredibly specific about how things worked. Take homicide law, for example. The old laws, attributed to Draco, were super restrictive about who could even bring a prosecution for murder, a dikiphono.
Who could?
It was limited to a really tight circle of relatives,
Yeah.
up to the sons of first cousins, plus some specific in-laws, like fathers-in-law and sons-in-law, and members of your phratry, your brotherhood group, could help out.
That's incredibly specific. Why does that detail matter for understanding removal?
Because the implication is crystal clear. If you weren't on that very short specific list, you could not prosecute for murder, full stop. It shows how formalized legal action was, defining not just the crime, but who even had the right to act. And that same level of formality applied to how they treated people who were already removed, the exiles.
Okay, so who counted as an exile in this formal legal sense, and what happened if they broke the rules and came back?
We get a crucial piece of information from the oath sworn by the bull, the Council of 500. It was amended at one point, and the new oath said the council wouldn't accept certain kinds of new legal actions, specifically things called indiexis or epigoge for things that happened in the past. It was like a measure to prevent endless old disputes resurfacing.
Kind of an amnesty for old stuff.
Sort of, and this is the key part, there was a major exception carved out. That protection did not apply to exiles. The oath explicitly said fielchen tin fugeventun, except against the fugitives or the exiles.
Okay, hang on. Ndiexis and apagogia, what were those exactly? And fi elesh and twin fugatown, that sounds important.
Very important. LALH, twin fugeventun, clearly singles out exiles. And who were these fugavants, these fugitives? Often they were people convicted of homicide and sentenced to exile. Or perhaps more commonly, defendants in homicide cases who had simply fled Athens before their trial concluded. They chose flight over facing judgment.
Okay, and an ndiexis and apagogia.
Those were types of summary legal procedures, basically ways for someone to denounce a person caught in the act of committing a crime or violating a specific legal status like an exile returning illegally. It allowed for immediate arrest and bringing the person before a magistrate or the council.
So the oath protected most people from these summary procedures for past issues, but it specifically kept that threat alive for anyone formally exiled.
Precisely. It formalized exile as a continuous, legally precarious status. If you were exiled and you dared to sneak back into Attica, anyone could potentially use ndiexis or epigogia to have you arrested and brought before the council. Banishment wasn't just a 10-year holiday. It was a formal legal status with potentially lethal consequences if you violated it. It shows the city had multiple legally defined ways to enforce removal beyond just that one big ostracism vote.
That's a much more complex picture of Athenian exile than just the potsherds. Now, if we contrast that Athenian system structured, legalistic, even if severe, with what happened in Rome, especially during the chaos of the late Republic, the difference is stark.
Oh, absolute chilling. Roman political removal could be brutally violent, especially when internal power struggles boiled over. Think about Sulla's second march on Rome around 82 BC, what followed with the infamous proscriptions.
Which weren't just exile, were they?
Not at all. The sources are clear. These were legally sanctioned murders and confiscations of property. Sulla and his supporters basically drew up lists of their political enemy.
Hit lists, essentially.
Pretty much. Being on the list meant you could be killed by anyone with impunity and often with a reward offered. And your property was confiscated by the state and usually auctioned off.
And this wasn't just about political elimination. Was there an economic motive, too?
A huge economic motive. It was designed to eliminate enemies, yes, but also to reward Sulla's supporters and fill the state treasury and supporters' pockets. We have this horrifying example, the case involving Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus,
Sulla's right-hand man.
one of his powerful freedmen, yeah. Chrysogonus allegedly conspired to get a wealthy man, Sextus Roscius of Ameria, put on the proscription list after the lists were officially closed. Why?
To get his property.
Exactly.
Right.
So he could buy Roscius's confiscated estates for a ridiculously low price at the state auction. Roscius himself was murdered, and then Chrysogonus apparently tried to frame Roscius's son for the murder to cover his tracks. Cicero actually defended the son in a famous early case.
That's breathtakingly corrupt. State-sanctioned murder for personal profit.
It shows how Roman political removal could degenerate into organized violence and outright judicial murder driven by greed. That's a world away from the Athenian idea of ostracism as a perhaps clumsy safety valve for the democracy.
Though Rome did also use exile in a more, let's say, judicial way, as a punishment for specific crimes like corruption.
Yes, absolutely. That also happened closer perhaps to our modern understanding of exile as a sentence.
Yeah.
A really famous example is Gaius Verus.
The governor of Sicily.
That's the one. He was governor around 73-71 BC and just systematically plundered the province. Extortion, theft of artworks, you name it. Cicero prosecuted him with incredible vigor.
And Verus didn't even wait for the verdict, did he?
No, the evidence Cicero presented was so overwhelming that Verus basically fled before the trial was over. He went into voluntary exile in Massilia, modern Marseille, and stayed there for the rest of his life. So that was judicial exile, a direct consequence of being found guilty of corruption.
Okay, and one more Roman point. Their whole philosophy about prisons was different too, wasn't it? Imprisonment itself wasn't really the punishment.
That's a really interesting and often overlooked point. Generally speaking, in Roman law, putting someone in prison wasn't the standard penalty for committing a crime. Prisons, carcerias, were mostly holding places.
Holding places for what?
For people awaiting trial or maybe awaiting execution if they'd received a death sentence. Or perhaps for debtors. But the punishment itself was usually something else: fines, corporal punishment, loss of status, or, very commonly, for serious offenses committed by upper-class individuals, exile or deportation.
So banishment was a core part of their penal system, not just a political tool.
Definitely. And even within deportation, you see gradations. There's a case under the Emperor Tiberius involving someone called Vibius Serenus. He was accused of something, maybe treason or public violence. The initial proposal was harsh: death penalty, or deportation to a barren, waterless island.
Sounds grim.
Very. But Tiberius actually vetoed that. He argued Serenus should instead be sent back to Amorgus, an island where he had already been deported for a previous offense. It shows that even within the Roman system of banishment, there could be, careful consideration of the severity. They weren't always just trying to kill people off. Sometimes it was about finding the right level of removal. But exile, in various forms, was absolutely central.
So all these methods we've been talking about, the general sphere, the Athenian legal exile, the Roman prescriptions, they all really stem from this fundamental tension, don't they? This paradox of a powerful state trying to balance freedom and control.
Absolutely. And in Athens, that tension played out in really fascinating social ways, too, not just in high politics. The sheer amount of political freedom enjoyed by the average citizen often clashed dramatically with how the traditional elite thought society should work.
You mean the old aristocratic families?
Exactly. We have this incredible text, often called the Old Oligarch, or attributed to Xenophon, though probably not by him. It's written by someone with clear oligarchical sympathies, and he's basically complaining about Athens.
Complaining about what specifically?
About the lack of clear class distinctions. He grumbles about what he calls the unreasonable freedom that wasn't just for poor citizens, but even for slaves and medics, the resident foreigners.
Unreasonable freedom for slaves. What did that look like? What was bothering him so much? It sounds less like high political theory and more like someone annoyed about, I don't know, everyday life.
It absolutely sounds like that. It's very much about social friction. His famous specific complaint, the anecdote he uses, is, "Why, you may not strike one of them a slave, nor will a slave make way for you in the street."
You can just picture this wealthy Athenian gentleman used to everyone jumping out of his way, being absolutely incensed that a slave doesn't move aside.
Precisely. It offended his sense of hierarchy, his expectation of deference. This social fluidity, this lack of automatic respect based on status, was deeply grating to the elite sensibilities. But the explanation the writer gives for why Athens allows this is even more revealing. and quite malicious.
Okay, what's the nasty explanation?
He argues that the real reason you can't just strike a slave or a metic on sight is because the ordinary Athenian citizens, the common folk, dress so badly.
Seriously?
Yes. He says they're so shabbily dressed that a respectable gentleman might accidentally mistake a poor citizen for a slave or a metic and strike a citizen by mistake, which would be illegal, of course. So in his view, the city protects slaves and medics with this unreasonable freedom simply as collateral damage to ensure the political rights of its own badly dressed poor citizens aren't accidentally violated by confused aristocrats.
Wow, that's dripping with contempt, isn't it? It says so much about the elite's resentment of the social leveling that democracy brought.
It really does. The very look and feel of Athenian street life, the blurring of outward distinctions, was offensive to the oligarchic mindset.
And this democratic system, fueled by that commercial empire you mentioned earlier, it wasn't just changing social interactions, it was changing the culture itself.
That's another point that same writer makes. He observes that Athens' role as a huge trading hub, its maritime empire bringing in goods and people and ideas from all over the Mediterranean and beyond, was inevitably changing the city.
Oh, so?
It was affecting the language, for instance. He complains that the Athenian dialect was becoming filled with foreign words, picked up from all the different peoples they interacted with. And habits and customs were changing too, becoming less purely Attic.
So the very success and openness of the democracy, the things that made it powerful, were simultaneously eroding its traditional, maybe more homogeneous identity.
Exactly. Much to the dismay of conservatives who valued that older identity and the clear social hierarchy that went with it. Another contradiction inherent in Athens' success.
Okay, so this whole environment, the constant political scrutiny, the social leveling, the ever-present threat of being removed from power, it must have created a unique psychological pressure on anyone ambitious, anyone wanting to lead.
Immense pressure. And this brings us to that really fundamental philosophical question about political ambition itself and the danger the Greeks called hubris, excessive pride, arrogance, stepping beyond your bounds.
And this is where someone like Socrates comes in, thinking about the dangers of politics.
Precisely. Socratic thought is deeply concerned with the corrosive effects of unchecked ambition. Socrates' whole philosophical project, in a way, suggested that real wisdom involved a kind of disenchantment with hubristic political ambition. You had to see past the allure of power and glory.
So the ideal Socratic life was about moderation, self-knowledge, staying away from that dangerous political game.
That seems to be the implication. That life of moderation was constantly under threat from what Plato, Socrates' student, sometimes described as erotic intoxication, this powerful, almost irrational desire, including the desire for political power and recognition.
It sounds like Socrates might have argued that the very qualities you needed to climb the political ladder in Athens, the ambition, the drive, maybe the ruthlessness, were the exact things that could corrupt your soul, or at least pull you away from that path of moderation and wisdom.
That's a core tension, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the tragic prime examples of this failure to resist the lure of political desire, even after being exposed to Socratic ideas, were two of his own associates, Critias and Alcibiades.
Right. Both ended up causing huge problems for Athens.
Huge problems. They were brilliant, charismatic young men, closely associated with Socrates. Yet ultimately they succumbed to that pre-Socratic enchantment, as one scholar puts it, that overwhelming ambition and desire for power that Socratic reasoning was supposed to help them overcome. Their political careers and the damage they did serve as stark warnings about how hard it was to maintain moderation and virtue in the high-stakes, high-reward environment of Athenian politics.
And the sources even hint that just being knowledgeable about politics, just being someone who knew things and might offer advice, was risky in itself. There's that Socratic line about people who do nothing well, are neither useful for anything nor beloved by God.
Yes, that critique implicitly points a finger at the dangers faced by anyone perceived as politically savvy or influential. Socrates himself, by questioning assumptions and offering unwelcome advice to the powerful, lived that risk every day and ultimately paid the price.
So he was saying if you have knowledge, you almost have a duty to advise those in power.
But doing so is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
In fact, it highlights the paradox. To be useful, maybe even morally obligated to contribute your knowledge to the city, you had to engage with power. But engaging with power, offering advice that might be unpopular or challenge the status quo, could easily lead to suspicion, resentment, and ultimately your own downfall, either at the hands of the rulers or the assembly itself if you became too prominent or controversial. You were caught in a bind between civic duty and self-preservation. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, tracing this complex reality of political accountability in the ancient world. We started with those towering figures from the Persian Wars, the heroes like Themistocles and Aristides.
Men who used incredible strategic skill and sometimes, yeah, pretty blatant political deception to save the state. Essential figures.
But, as we saw, that very success put them on shaky ground. They lived their whole public lives knowing that the same democratic system that praised them could, almost in an instant, decide they were too dangerous and just remove them.
Yeah, whether it was through that constant background fear of censure in the assembly or the more formal mechanisms like judicial exile based on specific laws, like that exception in the blue to goes we talked about.
Or even the extreme famous case of ostracism, though maybe less common than we sometimes think.
Right. Or shifting to Rome, the far more brutal state-sanctioned violence of the prescriptions. The sources make it pretty clear that political removal wasn't just some unfortunate side effect of politics.
It was built in.
It seems like it was an intrinsic feature, a high-stakes, often terrifying safety mechanism. It was how these powerful ancient states tried to control the inherent danger posed by their own most capable, most ambitious, most successful citizens. The state, ultimately, was trying to protect itself from its most powerful servants.
And that inherent fragility, that paradox, that's really the big takeaway for us today, isn't it? That the very ambition and genius that saved Athens, embodied in someone like Themistocles.
Who did the exact same thing that made his position unstable, led to political attacks, and eventually resulted in his own disgrace and exile. An incredible irony.
So here's something to maybe chew on after this deep dive. We've seen how Athens and Rome wrestled with this problem of powerful individuals.
And so the provocative thought for you, the listener, is this. How well do our own modern political systems manage this same challenge? How do we handle individuals who achieve enormous power or influence, whether it's political, economic, technological?
Do we have effective safety valves, or do we struggle to even identify when someone essential might also be becoming dangerous?
How do we, today, balance the need for exceptional leaders with the need to protect the stability and integrity of the state or society as a whole? Perhaps, as the Athenians seem to have instinctively feared, the very people who achieve the most success are sometimes the ones who warrant the most careful scrutiny. Food for thought.